Good afternoon, everyone. It is 12:01. We have a few folks still joining. We are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the StaffBuffalo and HRBuffalo 2023 HR Compliance Update. We have some exciting information to share today. I am Alicia Tomasello, the president of HRBuffalo. If you have not heard of HRBuffalo, we are a full-service HR consulting firm here in Buffalo, New York. Our sister company is StaffBuffalo. They are a recruiting and talent acquisition organization. And we have many of our staff and leadership on the presentation today. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us. All right, well, we are going to go ahead and dive right into the material. So as many of you are probably aware, Governor Hochul continues to implement a lot of new workforce rules and regulations. We saw a slew of activity in December and extending into the recent weeks. So today we are going to talk about the recent regulatory changes that impact workforce and labor and employment. We're also at the very end going to talk about what might be on the horizon in terms of new legislation that has been mentioned or might be forthcoming. Before we get into the content, just a little bit of housekeeping. So I'm going to talk today about 7 particular areas that are new or there has been a change. And the format is going to be that I'm going to give you sort of a who, what, where, and why of this change and some key points. I'm going to talk about implementation guidance, and then I'm going to move to the next topic. At the end of the review of the 7 areas, we're going to open it up for question and answer. We are going to ask that you type your questions in the Q&A chat, and then we will answer those after we've been completed with the whole presentation. All right, so here's our agenda. As I mentioned, we have 7 topics that we're going to speak about, and we have a bonus topic, which is what might be on the horizon in similar areas. So first, we're going to talk about the statewide pay transparency law. Next, the electronic labor law postings and what those requirements are. We're going to cover the fairly minor recent change to New York State paid family leave. We're going to talk about the New York State minimum wage update and the impact on the salaried exempt threshold. We are going to update COVID rules and regulations regarding quarantine and isolation pay. And we're also going to talk about vaccine pay and the extension to that law. We will then go into the updated lactation break rules and the new rules regarding protected absences from work. So we're going to go ahead and jump right in to our first topic. I have decided to cover the topic that is effective the farthest away first, because this, I believe, is the most significant of all of the laws that we're going to talk about today. This is a very significant change. As you may be aware, New York City already has had a pay transparency law requiring the posting of salaries or salary ranges within job postings. So last month, Governor Hochul did sign this into law. It does not take effect until September 17th, 2023, but the statewide pay transparency law applies to all New York State employers, labor organizations, recruiting firms, and employment agencies with 4 or more employees within the state. We'll talk more about how this might impact remote workers, and what it requires is that a pay range or pay rate is posted in all postings for external or internal hiring, transfers, and promotions. And if there is a job description for the position, that must be posted as well. As I mentioned, this takes effect September 17th, 2023, so we do have time to prepare. And we'll talk today about some critical things you might be able to think through in those next months to make sure that you're well prepared for this. The why regarding this law, I have it in quotes here because this was taken from the regulations. The intention that was stated was to address racial and gender-based pay gaps with that transparency. And we'll talk a little bit about what that might mean and how you might have legal exposure based on how you manage this, with the potential for gender-based pay claims or race-based pay claims, and potential inequity issues if we do not analyze our current workforce as well with those new pay ranges that we are going to be posting. All right, so let's get into the details. So as I mentioned, this law does apply to remote workers who are in other states if some of the work can be performed within New York State. It does require that employers include the compensation range in all of those job advertisements. So as I mentioned, it includes new positions, promotions, and transfer opportunities, and it includes internal postings as well. And I do have here within the slide the exact definition of what the compensation range is supposed to be, because this is a big question: is what would a compensation range be? What is a pay range or a pay rate? So in the law, the compensation range is defined as the minimum and maximum annual salary or hourly range of compensation for the opportunity that the employer in good faith believes to be an accurate compensation at the time of the posting. So a lot there, right? But really it's saying, what is the rate or range of pay that you believe as the employer is the appropriate range when you post that position. As I mentioned, this does include internal postings. And if you have commission-based roles, this is a deviation from the New York City law, a little bit of a difference here. If there's a compensation that is commission-based only, your posting just needs to have a statement that the role is commission-based. And there are rules, as you may be aware of, around written commission agreements in New York State if your staff are compensated on a whole or in part on commission basis. One of the things that I think is really, really significant about this law is the record keeping requirement. So this law requires that employers keep records regarding history of pay ranges, promotions, transfers, and the history of those job descriptions if they exist. This is very critical to think about. I can envision a lot of draft job descriptions, things that might be outdated, different variations of compensation ranges, promotion analysis, and those discussions and documentation around how those pay decisions are being made and how job descriptions are drafted and updated. And I think it's really critical, and we'll get to this in the implementation guidance, that we think about what we have on file and potentially eliminate old drafts of documents, but clean up our files because of this very critical record keeping requirement in this new law. And lastly, there is an anti-retaliation provision. So this says that for both job applicants and employees, they may not be retaliated against for exercising their rights under the law. So that could mean that an employee raised a question about why a pay range was not listed in a posting. You may not then choose to not hire that person on the basis that they questioned whether you were in compliance with the law, just as an example. I like to talk about the penalties for different laws that come out. I think it's an important piece to the analysis. We certainly would never suggest that you not follow the laws, but as a business, you do have to make risk decisions. Those decisions are for you to make, but for your awareness, there's no private right of action for this law. This means that an employee may not sue the employer directly. However, the New York State Commissioner of Labor will be investigating and prosecuting violations. And I've identified here the civil penalties that could be imposed. They range from $1,000 for the first violation up to $3,000 for third or subsequent violations. There are many unanswered questions, as is often the case with new laws that come out. A lot of things are not always thought through before the law is passed. The good news, as I've mentioned here on the slide, is that there is a regulation pending. So we will receive hopefully detailed implementation regulations before this takes effect in September. We'll be able to comb through those and get some of the answers to the unanswered questions. One of the things that is unclear at this time is whether all 4 of those employees must be in New York State for the employer to be a covered employer. So we certainly have some small employers that may have only 2 or 3 employees within New York State and remote workers outside of New York State. So hopefully the regulations will address whether that is a covered employer. And then the words job description are not defined. So the regulations state that the job description needs to be posted. The law states that the job description needs to be posted if it exists, but it does not define what a job description is. And as you all know, there are many ways to describe what a person does. There are functional org charts, job postings, official position descriptions. So hopefully when the regulations come out, it will clarify what is meant by a job description. Because again, we have the record keeping requirement and we have the requirement to post, and we need some clarity around this before this regulation takes effect. Because if you have draft documents functional org charts, position postings that you do not deem to be the job description, there could be some debate as to whether you need to post those kinds of materials with your position posting. All right, so the fun part that we like to talk about the most is what do we do about this? How do we implement this and make sure that we are compliant and that we're making the right decisions for our business as we have this small window of time before this law takes effect. So as I mentioned, you really want to ensure that your job descriptions are updated and that they are ready to be posted with that job posting if you have them. And I would encourage you all to think about draft job descriptions or descriptions of duties that are not really a job description that you would want to have posted, and maybe eliminate drafts and make sure that you have those records that come September, you might have to turn over to the Department of Labor if you run into an issue with the requirements of this law. The pay strategy around those pay ranges, this is very, very critical. So determine what your pay strategy is. You know, we work with small, mid-sized, and large employers all across Western New York, and we know that some companies don't have any formal process for determining pay. Managers or a human resources representative or a finance representative may come up with a pay range based on maybe what someone in the role makes now or looking around online. And then we have organizations that have very, very structured compensation ranges, compensation philosophies. We do market pricing of jobs regularly and build out ranges. And when we do that work, we know that there are a lot of decisions that you as the employer can make as you're developing your ranges. You can decide that for some jobs, you're just going to have one pay rate. So we certainly see that with some postings currently. There are positions that say this job pays $65,000 and that's it. There is no range. If you do have a range, how broad is your range going to be? We at times develop ranges where the maximum is 20% higher than the midpoint, but other ranges have the maximum be 25% higher than the midpoint. So thinking ahead, taking this window of time before this takes effect to really think about what is your pay strategy. And as we get into potential impacts on your existing workforce, questions, concerns that might be brought up there, it will become even more obvious how much you do need a comprehensive pay strategy before we get into any of this. Because if you don't think about that in advance and you throw up a range, the implications internally for potential claims of pay inequity, those could be pretty significant. And again, we have this window of time. So we really wanted to get this information out to everyone so that you do take these next 8 months or so to think about how you're going to approach this before you have to actually be posting information publicly. One thing that we've talked quite a bit about with employers over the last month or so with regard to this pay transparency law is whether employers will choose not to post positions as much or for specific positions to not post them at all. So it's very important to understand that this law states that you have to post the compensation range in a posting, an internal posting, an external posting, anything that's posted. And so it will be interesting to see whether employers will choose to hire without actually posting a job. And this might be something that could be considered for particular types of positions. And we might want to see that based on what your needs are there. Very, very important that we think about the strategy to address compensation questions and requests for compensation reviews from our existing workforce. So if you do not share your pay strategy, your pay philosophy, and your pay ranges with your current workforce, it is expected that when you begin to post your pay ranges on your jobs in September, that you will receive questions from your current workforce. This might be particularly the case if you have multiple positions that are the same. So you have filled jobs and posted jobs, and they're the same title, arguably probably the same pay ranges, and maybe you post a pay range and you have current staff that are at the low end of that range. It should be expected that you are going to get inquiries from your current staff about what that pay range means, whether that is their pay range, why are they low in the range or in the middle of the range, not at the top of the range, and they might ask to have their compensation reviewed in light of the range that you are posting. There's certainly no requirement in this law that you entertain any of that. However, we are all, I'm sure, wanting to be good employers that want to treat our staff well. We want to retain our staff. We want them to feel happy and well compensated in their roles. So really thinking through what is our approach going to be to these inquiries that we are likely to get? How will we explain that? What will we share? Will we share pay ranges? How will we explain why current staff are paid what they are paid? in light of the ranges that we are posting. And I want to jump down just to the last bullet on this slide because it ties together. The best way to address those questions is to take the time before this is implemented to do a complete compensation market and equity assessment of all of your employees and all of your positions before this requirement takes place. So market reviews and equity reviews are two different things. The market review is looking at your positions compared to market data and saying, is the range that I have updated? Is it an accurate reflection of the market for this role, the market pay rate? There are a lot of different sources of market data. You can purchase that, you can look it up, you can hire a firm like ours to do your compensation market pricing. There are a lot of ways to market price your jobs, but that is saying for this particular position, what is the market price for that role? What is the market midpoint? What is the market range? Equity assessments are taking your workforce and comparing different employees at different pay rates and analyzing why they're paid differently. Many employees are slotted within a pay range based on their years of relevant experience for the role, and sometimes an equity analysis can take all of your employees in that job, how many years of experience they have, and line them up equally compared to each other so that there is equity. These are things that you might want to consider doing before this posting requirement takes place, as that will significantly mitigate the questions and concerns and requests for assessments after the fact that you may get from your existing workforce. You can be very comfortable that you have a strategy that's been thought out, communicated to staff, and that you've reviewed not just market, but also internal equity, and that you already are comfortable explaining, if you choose to explain, which you're not required to, but explaining to an employee, you know, this is why you make the pay rate you do. This is why you don't need a raise based on this range that we posted, for example. As we mentioned, the document retention requirement for this law is significant. So we recommend identifying the documents and information that will need to be retained and how and where you're going to retain that, who's going to be responsible for keeping that information. You know, for small businesses that don't have an HR department, maybe their electronic files are not completely in order, you want to think about where you're going to retain that list of information, which is the history of pay ranges, promotions, transfers, as well as those job descriptions. And then training. So training is very, very important as these things become more complex with different rules coming out. It is critical to train not just your managers, but your recruiters, your HR team around this pay transparency law to ensure that we are in compliance. You know, we do have small organizations locally here where managers post positions. Sometimes an admin assistant might post a position. It's critical that everyone who is involved in posting internal or external positions, including those transfers and promotions, that they understand the requirements for the pay transparency, as well as those document retention requirements. All right, so that wraps up the statewide pay transparency law. So go ahead and think about what your questions are for this one. You can put them in the Q&A chat now. You can save them to the end. We are going to move over to the next one. All right, so this one, you know, not nearly as impactful as the statewide pay transparency, but we do want employers to understand that there is a new requirement. This requirement was signed into law on December 16th of 2022 and was effective immediately. Always nice when that happens, not really giving us any time to prepare. Fortunately, you know, we all had our regular postings already up and compliant. This law now says that all employers in the state of New York have to provide digital copies of those required workplace posters to all of their employees. So this does include both federal and state labor law postings. It does not just apply to state postings, even though it's a state law. And the rationale provided for why this new law was passed was the increase in remote work over the last several years. I assume the impression here is that remote workers do not have access to those workplace postings, and so we need to provide them an alternative means to know and understand their rights under the labor laws. And this applies to all required workplace postings. So what does this mean? The key points here are, so the words in the law, the word is digital. I know we've said electronic, a lot of different words for that, but it is digital distribution to employees. And it states that it may be accomplished by either email or through the employer's website. So lots of questions there, and we'll cover what we don't know about this. We do know this applies to applicants as well as current employees. So this is really critical because if you have an employee intranet that is only accessible by your current workforce, that would not meet the requirements of this law. It does require that those applicants for positions be able to see, their rights under the federal and state laws. And so we do have to post those in a place that applicants can see them as well. And we can talk a little bit about how you might accomplish that. There's also a separate requirement that you tell employees and applicants that the electronic postings are available. And this, there's a lot of commentary about, well, if we're posting them already, why do we have to tell people that we're posting? If you email them out, don't they know that you're emailing them? Why do you have to tell them you emailed them when you emailed them, right? But this is what the law says. And certainly if you're putting the postings on an external intranet, maybe on a link somewhere that's not easy to find, it does make sense that you would want to notify your workforce and applicants, hey, you can find your electronic digital copies of your workplace postings on our website, perhaps provide them a link or a means to access that information. That would be compliant with this specific requirement. One of the things that we do recommend here is thinking about whether you want to put that notice of where those postings are right in your employee handbook if you have one. That's always a nice place to maintain all of your required notifications to employees. That way you don't have to distribute them on a regular basis for your workforce that are there. If they're receiving a handbook, maybe they're signing off on a handbook. That is a nice place where you can put this notification of where those digital postings can be found. And just to mention, this does not replace the physical posting requirements. There is still a requirement for all employers in New York State that required federal and state postings actually be physically posted on each floor of your building where employees come to work. So some implementation guidelines. First, as I mentioned, there is still a question that is unanswered that we might get some clarity on soon, hopefully. With the obligation to email or post these on a website, that is what's specifically stated in the law, it opens the question of what do employers do if they do not have a website or email? And certainly you might think that I'm living in the dark ages to suggest that there's a company that doesn't have those two things, but we know that there are small businesses, maybe legacy businesses that have been around for a while that just haven't yet quite gotten their website or their company emails in place. And so how would they comply with this law? And does the law create a requirement to actually establish a website or company email address? So one thing that you could do if you do not have a website or an email is you could collect personal emails and send the information that way. The law only says that you have to post it on a website or send it through email. And so certainly that would be compliant if you do not have a company email or a company website. We have talked this through with many employers. It's been over a month now that this law has already been in place, and due to the requirement to have the postings available to both applicants and current workforce, we do recommend that you consider as an option the external website for this material. There's not another great way that we have identified of making sure that this information is available to applicants and your current workforce. Certainly if there is a location within your applicant tracking system where applicants apply for positions that you can put the electronic postings where they would apply, that could be another solution as well. But a lot of the applicant tracking systems do not have that for a candidate, the ability to load and for them to be able to view the digital copies of the workplace postings. And so you do need to notify those candidates, those applicants, that the postings are available, but you can have it, in your job posting at the bottom. You could say, required federal and state employee rights information is posted on our external website with a link to that website. And that would satisfy this requirement for both applicants and your current workforce. And as I mentioned with the previous law, you are required to maintain records of compliance with this law in case you are audited or have a concern or a question or a complaint from an employee. And so maintain records of where you're posting the digital copies, as well as that separate communication requirement that you notify employees that they are available digitally and where they can locate them. All right, well, that will do it for electronic labor law postings. We will jump ahead to the fairly minor amendment to New York State paid family leave. So New York State paid family leave was implemented in 2018. So getting settled here with the law, and it appears that it has been running pretty much as predicted from a cost perspective, but the state continues to look at ways to make sure that the workplace is accommodating families. And that was the stated intention for this. As you can see, quote was to improve the lives of working New Yorkers and their families. And so this amendment was to add siblings as a covered family member for purposes of your employees taking paid family leave. This law applies to all private employers with at least one employee. Public employers are not required to comply with the law, but may opt in and voluntarily provide paid family leave benefits and purchase that insurance policy. So the change is extending leave to caring for siblings with a serious health condition. So previously the law covered parents and children and other family members with a serious health condition. And there are also some other changes to the premium cost for employees that they pay out of the payroll deduction for this coverage, as well as the benefit amount when an employee takes paid family leave. So we'll mention both of those. So sibling is defined as biological siblings, adopted siblings, step siblings, and half siblings. And that is the new addition to the covered family members. Everything else remains the same. They still have to have a serious health condition and apply for the leave, as well as submit the application to the insurance carrier. I'm sure all of the paid family leave insurance carriers have prepared for this and have a process now, if they have the unique application forms, but have that process to be able to accept the applications for sibling-based leave and do those approvals on their end. So for 2023, the contribution by employees, the percent of their wages was reduced. And this annual contribution for 2023 is $399.43. This is a reduction of $24.28 from the previous year. So I think we all anticipated that the costs for paid family leave would significantly increase. We saw a lot of utilization of this benefit, and the benefit amount is quite high compared to things like unemployment, workers' compensation payments, New York State disability. These payments per week can be quite high for employees. And definitely over the last several years, we saw pretty significant increases to the cost to employees to fund this benefit. So a bit surprised to see the reduction, and it's not really significant, but nice to see that going down versus going up for this year. Similarly, the actual benefit amount that employees can receive increased just slightly. So as you all know, this benefit amount is based on the statewide average weekly wage. So employees can receive 67% of their current pay up to the maximum of the statewide average weekly wage. So that average weekly wage did increase by about $63 for 2023. So some implementation guidance here, really it's just making sure that your internal employees who manage leaves of absence understand these new rules. Maybe it's a leave administrator, maybe it's an HR person, maybe it's a finance person or a manager. Just making sure that when an employee comes forward and says, my sibling has a serious health condition, what are my options? What are my rights? Can I take a leave of absence? Can I get any payment? That you are well versed in this amendment and can tell them exactly what they are eligible for and help them through the process. We are required to do that as employers. We are required to assist them with those application forms, fill out the employer section, and facilitate the process with the insurance carriers. All of the insurance carriers were required to add this coverage to the existing policies, and this did take effect January 1st of 2023. However, there was a somewhat confusing clause that said, or when your insurance policies covering New York State paid family leave renew or are updated. So for some employers, it was not exactly the 1st of January, but I think that's generally when this has been implemented. So you do want to make sure that if you are running internal benefits calculations, that your leave administrators or your other staff are aware of the change in the maximum benefit amount. So when I'm assisting an employee on going out on a leave of absence, a lot of times I'll actually help them in calculating the dollars that they will receive from New York State paid family leave, because perhaps they can use sick time or PTO time or vacation time to supplement that. And so we need to run some calculations to make sure that they don't exceed their normal pay. So we would take the maximum benefit that they'll receive under paid family leave and run some calculations against their current daily or weekly pay to determine the hours or dollars that they can utilize from their accrued paid time off. And so just to make sure that if you are running those calculations, if you have spreadsheets or formulas that you've been using, to update them with the new maximum weekly benefit amount. And then all of the payroll systems do this a little bit different. Many of them automatically update your PFL employee payroll deductions, but just to make sure that that in fact has been updated, it's a reduction. So employees should be paying less. We certainly don't want to have our folks pay more than they are supposed to for this benefit. So checking in your system, contacting your payroll vendor if you have one, if you run the payroll yourself, making sure that those changes have been made so that the deduction to employees has been appropriately reduced. All right, so jumping over into minimum wage and salaried exempt changes. Hopefully everyone saw these and has been able to implement them effectively. It has been every year for at least 6 or 8 years now that the minimum wage has gone up every December and the corresponding salaried exempt threshold has gone up. You know, we had those scheduled 4 years or so of increases that we could all predict out. And then over the last couple of years here, the increases have been announced annually. We'll talk a little bit about what the future of minimum wage increases might look like as well, based on the recent comments from Governor Hochul. So this, of course, applies to all New York State employers, with the exception of those downstate employers. So employers in New York City and Westchester and some of those areas, they do have their own minimum wage and salaried exempt threshold. Those did not change at all for this year. The minimum wage is already $15 per hour downstate, and the salaried exempt threshold is just above $58,000, so higher than upstate for both of those pay rates. And so the change this year is really for the upstate or across the state employers, not to include downstate New York City minimum wage and salaried exempt. So if you have offices that are downstate, you might want to check on those. But again, the minimum wage and salary exempt didn't change for them. Minimum wage is $15 an hour for all of those locations. And the salaried exempt threshold is just a little over $58,000. So the change for this, it always takes place on December 31st of the previous year. It is not a January 1 change. So you do need to make sure that on that day, your pay rates were changed if they were under the new minimum requirements. And the stated purpose for the continued increases to minimum wage and salaried exempt are inflation, as well as the statewide goal of achieving $15 per hour for minimum wage. So the minimum wage for non-exempt employees is $14.20 per hour. And obviously the overtime requirement still remains to pay time and 1/2 their regular rate of pay for hours worked over 40 in a work week. Salaried exempt employees must be paid a salary of at least $1,064.25 per week. This is $55,341 annually. They must be at or above that amount in order to be deemed salaried exempt. As I mentioned previously, the downstate minimum wage and exempt threshold did not change this year. And we'll talk a little bit at the end about some of the comments made by Governor Hochul in her State of the State address on January 10th. One of the things that she spoke about is the indexing of the minimum wage for future years, that once we hit that $15 an hour minimum wage, which we will see later this year in December, most likely, after that we would index the increases and they would automatically go up annually by the Consumer Price Index. So we'll talk about that a little bit at the end. All right, so what do you need to do here to make sure that you are in compliance? Of course, you need to review your pay rates. You need to ensure that there are not any employees in your organization that make below $14.20 per hour. And you need to ensure that if you have salaried exempt employees, that they are making $55,341 per year, or you need to switch them to hourly if they are below that amount. And of course, there are many, many rules about being salaried exempt, such as not deducting from that set salary for certain things, making sure that that is a set weekly or biweekly amount that they receive and not having variations in that salary. That is certainly a requirement. As this salaried exempt minimum has increased so substantially over the last several years, we work with companies who have to assess whether to change those employees to hourly because the pay increase would be too large for those folks. And as this number continues to climb, and we expect that will continue in future years, we would definitely recommend that you analyze what this new salary means for your employees who might be being paid on a salaried exempt basis and figure out, does it make sense to give them that raise up to 55,341, or does it make more sense to switch them to hourly non-exempt? Often if folks are, working 40 hours, not really working more than that, you're not going to see a cost increase if you just convert them over into an hourly non-exempt. You might not incur overtime costs. So definitely something that you should significantly analyze. And just keep in mind on that topic that if you do switch someone from salaried to hourly and they're non-exempt, you have to track all of their work hours and maintain the documentation of that. So make sure you're mindful of that if you are transitioning someone from salary to hourly. And then, of course, ensure that those hiring managers and your recruiters are trained. Again, we work with a lot of small companies where managers make hiring decisions every day. They don't necessarily run them by HR. They might not even have HR, and positions are posted, positions are offered. Time cards are done by managers. And so we really want to make sure that anyone who's making a hiring decision, any sort of pay decisions, or changing someone to a salaried role, that they understand these new minimums. All right, so let's talk about good old COVID. This continues to stay around. We actually saw a lot of COVID activity over the last couple of months with cases going back up again. So we have two separate things that we want to talk about today for this one. We want to talk about the New York State COVID paid sick time for quarantine or isolation. This continues to be in place. There is no expiration to that particular law. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what you need to do for that one. But there have been some changes around quarantine and isolation rules for an exposure. If you did not test positive, but you were exposed to someone who did test positive or who was symptomatic, there were some recent changes in September regarding following the CDC rules on that. So we'll talk about that. For the vaccine pay, this also was not really changed recently, but it was extended. So the vaccine pay, which is the pay to go and receive your shot or your booster shot of the vaccine, there's paid time off for that, which we will talk about. That was extended. It originally expired in December of 2022, and it was extended for a full year and now will run through the end of 2023. And again, the stated reasons for these ongoing laws is the continued effects and concerns of COVID-19. This law does apply to all New York State employers. However, there are different pay rules based on employer size, which we will go over. All right, so first we're going to talk about the vaccine pay. This requirement has been around for some time now. It did not change, it was just extended. But this says that employers must provide employees with a sufficient period of time, not to exceed 4 hours, of paid time off from work per dose, including booster shots, for receiving the COVID-19 vaccine. And then just important to note that the time would be paid at the employee's regular rate of pay, and you cannot utilize any existing leave accruals. One thing that we see a lot of confusion on, and it's very understandable, I think the verbiage that the state uses to talk about New York State sick pay that came out in 2020, COVID sick pay, quarantine and isolation pay, vaccine pay, it's very confusing. And we often see employers thinking that it is okay to require employees to use their New York State paid sick time for getting their vaccine or on days that they cannot come to work due to a required quarantine or isolation. That is not accurate. Those are separate pay types completely. And there is no funding, so to speak, for the quarantine or isolation pay. If someone is under a mandatory or precautionary quarantine or isolation and cannot come to work, they are required to be paid by the employer. And we can talk about how many days of pay in the next slides. But that plus the vaccine pay, these are fully employer paid benefits. And unlike the FCRA rules that were around at the federal level for some time and then expired, There's no ability to recoup these costs through, tax rebates or anything like that that was allowed under the FCRA rules. Okay, so for the quarantine and isolation pay, this is where the pay amount is broken up by employer size. So if you're an employer with 10 or fewer employees and less than $1 million in income, in annual income, you are only required to provide unpaid time off if an employee has a mandatory or precautionary quarantine or isolation. Afterwards, if the employee may also use New York State paid family leave and disability benefits because there is no pay. For those employers that are between 11 and 99 employees, as well as those small employers with the revenue annual income of greater than $1 million, there is a paid sick time requirement for the COVID-19 quarantine or isolation. That is at least 5 days of paid time. And then after the 5 days of employer pay, they can then continue to use paid family leave and disability benefits if they continue to be incapacitated from working. And then we'll talk about the larger employers on the next slide, but a few things here just to keep in mind. Those employee counts are still stated in the law as being as of January 1st, 2020. So if your size has changed since then, it states that the employee count is as of that date, which is obviously during COVID that occurred, or just before COVID hit in March of that year. And what has changed a lot with this lately is those quarantine or isolation periods. So again, if you were covered by the federal FCRA paid time off for quarantine or isolation, that was very complicated and allowed employee pay for all sorts of things, like you had to go to your kid's school or the school was closed. The New York State COVID pay, not the vaccine pay, but the pay if you have COVID and you're not able to come to work, that is limited to a time that you are required, not choosing, but required to quarantine or isolate. And you are required to quarantine or isolate if you test positive for COVID or you have COVID symptoms. Previously, if you were not vaccinated, you also needed to quarantine if you were in close contact with someone else who tested positive. That was eliminated in September. If you look on the state DOH website, they removed that and said that they're going to defer to the CDC requirements, and the CDC does not have that exposure, close contact, quarantine, or isolation. The precautionary is what they call it. So now it's only if there is a positive test or COVID symptoms, and the requirement is to quarantine or isolate for 5 days. And if at the end of the 5 days, you are fever-free and your symptoms are improving, you are cleared of your quarantine on day 6. So even though these laws and under the larger employers, there is a requirement to provide up to 14 days of paid COVID time, that is only for the time period that you are under a quarantine or isolation, and it is not up to the employee or even the employer to decide how long a quarantine or isolation is. That is set. One of the things that we talk about a lot and has been a bit of a relief throughout these several years with COVID is employers aren't making their decisions about these things. And I think that that's really helpful. I'm not a healthcare professional. I'm not a scientist. We're HR folks, right? And we're trying to follow the rules, but it's actually been a little bit refreshing that we don't have to make our own decisions. And we can say, the Center for Disease Control and the New York State Department of Health has decided that the quarantine period is 5 days. And you might think it can be 6 or 10 or whatever it is. You might think you're not ready to come back from work. All we're saying is you're not under quarantine or isolation anymore. And with this pay rule, you would have to be under quarantine or isolation from essentially a government official, is what it said originally, that it has to be a government mandated quarantine or isolation. Now, in the very, very beginning of COVID, you may recall that when you tested positive, your test results were sent to the Erie County Department of Health or Niagara County Department of Health or wherever you were. And then you might get a call or an email and they'd say, you have to quarantine and this is how long you have to stay in your house and you can't go to work, you can't go to the grocery store, you can't go to the gym. As COVID really picked up, that kind of phased out. And so we had a lot of employees who would say, well, I tested positive, but maybe it was a home test or I never got a call from the Department of Health. How do I prove to you, Mr. Employer, that I'm entitled to this pay? And so the state did come out with the employee attestation forms, one for quarantine, one for isolation, where the employee could self-attest that they had qualifying circumstances, needed to quarantine or isolate, and could submit that to the employer to be eligible for the pay. Many employers also just said, send me a copy of your positive test, something like that, so that they had enough proof, because the pay can be quite costly, 5 days of full pay, not coming from any accrued banks of time, and up to 14 days. So we've had some employees that weren't able to come back after day 5. Their symptoms were worsening. They might have been hospitalized. They might have still had a fever. And in those situations, you might have to pay up to 2 weeks of full pay to those employees. So significant, but need to determine certainly the balance of what you're going to require as that proof. And the state has allowed those employee affirmations of quarantine or affirmations of isolation to be submitted as that proof. And keep in mind, if you require an employee to go get tested, you do have to pay for that testing, and you may have to pay for the time that they went to get the test too. So I think that has hindered employers from saying you have to go get an official test from a healthcare provider. But of course, at-home tests aren't necessarily, number one, even reliable, and we don't know for sure that is that employee's actual test. So these affirmation of quarantine or isolation forms, they do still exist on the New York State website, and it is a bit confusing still, because they do still have the exposure attestation there. They have not pulled that down. It still exists. So in theory, an employee could fill out a form saying, I had an exposure to someone who tested positive, and I think I might need to quarantine or isolate. Again, as of September, New York State said that is no longer a requirement, and we're going to follow CDC, which is only positive test or COVID symptoms. All right, so we got a bit off track. I want to jump back and talk to the large employer requirement. So employers with 100 or more employees, doesn't matter what your annual income is. There, as I mentioned, you are required to provide up to 14 days of that COVID sick time for required quarantine or isolation. Very important to keep that in mind. It's not anyone's choice. Doesn't even necessarily matter what the doctor said. Hopefully the doctors are following the guidelines, but really it is, what did the government say the employee has to do in terms of their positive test or their symptoms. So normally we are seeing this run that 5-day quarantine period. We are not seeing 14 days, but as I mentioned, there are situations where an employee is not fever-free, does not experience an improvement of symptoms, and is not able to return to the workplace. And those situations, the maximum pay is the 14 days. This is 14 calendar days. This is not, 10 days of work and then almost another week. It's not 3 weeks, it's 2 weeks. So really it would be 10 paid days for employees that work Monday through Friday. Job protection is required for all leaves. So we're going to talk a little bit later about Governor Hochul's new laws regarding protected absences from work. So I'm sure that none of the employers on this update would be disciplining or discharging employees for missing work due to COVID quarantine or isolation, but just be mindful that this is a protected absence and they cannot be terminated or replaced while they're off on that leave. As I mentioned, employees who are exposed to others who are suspected of COVID or who test positive no longer have to quarantine. The CDC rules are that they should wear a mask or respirator for 10 days around others, again, for those exposures, and that they should be tested 5 or more days after the exposure, even if they do not have symptoms, but there's no requirement to quarantine or isolate for an exposure any longer. It's only for positive tests and COVID symptoms. This is regardless of vaccination status. So up through September, only fully vaccinated employees, including boosters, were exempt from that quarantine if they had an exposure. So if you were not vaccinated and had an exposure, the previous rule was that you did have to quarantine or isolate to see if you began to become symptomatic. But as of September, vaccination status is irrelevant. None of the exposures require that quarantine or isolation. And of course, the caveat to all of it is unless symptoms occur. So COVID symptoms themselves are still a reason to quarantine and isolate. And recall as well that what we're seeing sometimes is that the employee will have some symptoms and they'll go for a test. And it appears that the time between taking the test and getting the test results is always a mandatory quarantine or isolation as well. So we do get notes from doctors, we get those affirmations of quarantine from employees when they're waiting for their test results. So because you would have been symptomatic to go to get the test, you do have to quarantine for that waiting period as well. Okay, so how do we navigate all of this? Many of these things we already put in place previously. So we already set up our pay codes in our payroll system, right? We have COVID vaccine pay for if someone's going to get their vaccination or a booster shot. So we've already set that up with that maximum of 4 hours. We've already set our COVID quarantine or isolation pay with that requirement for, based on your size. Is it 5 days? Is it up to 14 days? And so hopefully everybody already has that all set up, but check your systems if you're not sure. Definitely train your HR and your managers. So these are situations that are likely going to go to a manager first. That's what we see, especially in larger or smaller organizations. In larger organizations, there might be a protocol where you have to contact HR right away if you test positive and you just follow the process. And we'll talk a little bit later about our recommendation for that. But what we're seeing is in smaller organizations or organizations without a robust HR team, the employee is calling their manager, sending a test result to their manager saying, I'm sick, I have COVID symptoms, and that kind of thing. And so that manager needs to understand how to navigate these questions and what the employee rights are, or they need to be referred to some sort of human resources representative who is an expert on these matters. So train your HR, train your managers, make sure that we know the employee rights. We're still seeing a lot of confusion under these areas, which is certainly well understood as it continues to be quite complex. Determine your testing and proof requirements for the quarantines and isolation. So we talked about the state attestation forms. I'm not really seeing a lot of those. We occasionally see them. More often than not, the employers are requiring a proof of a positive test if that's the reason for the quarantine or isolation. And you can require that the test results be provided so that you know that that person is entitled to this pay. But think about whether you're going to allow an at-home test, or are you going to make them go and get an official test from a healthcare provider, and then keeping in mind, of course, the obligation to pay for the cost of the testing and the time away from work that they had to take to go to get the testing, if you are going to mandate that. So we do see a lot of employers allowing some sort of proof of an at-home test, even knowing that it's possible that really wasn't that employee's test, or they found a picture of a positive test online and took a picture of that. But whatever it is, make sure that you do have some sort of ability to provide proof that the employee is under a quarantine or isolation and unable to come to work. You can use those self-affirmation forms if you would like, but try to be consistent with this. We don't want to see inconsistencies in one person has to submit a test, another one, you just take their word for it. That's not fair. That's not consistent, can give rise to discrimination claims and employee discontent and all of that. So determine your standard and stick with it is the best approach. Understanding those rules for the quarantine and isolation. So we're still finding that folks are not clear on that 5 days. And we run across businesses that are paying 14 days of pay every time versus saying, well, it's up to 14, but we only pay you if you have to quarantine or isolate, which caps out at 5 days as long as, your symptoms are improving and you are fever free. So just making sure that you're following that 5-day change. It was originally 14 and then it was 10 and then it was 5, but it's been 5 for quite a while. That is CDC and DOH. You're not deciding that as an employer. So if your employee is upset about coming back on day 6, it's not a choice that you make yourself. I will say there are situations where, you might want to think about whether you want to have that employee come back on day 6. And we have a lot of clients that have some remote flexibility, and you always have the option too of allowing the employee to take some PTO or vacation, or maybe a New York State sick day, whatever they have. If they're not ready to come back from work, let them take more time off if you can, and if there's other pay that is available to them. So not forcing people to come back when they're ill and not up for it, like we would do with anyone. We would never force an employee to come to work if they said they were sick. But there could be attendance consequences, and they could have to use their own accrued time. So you're not going to continue to pay them this pay, but it's important to clarify to the employee, you are no longer under quarantine or isolation. I'm not saying you have to come to work. I'm not saying you can't come to work. I'm just saying that if you don't feel good and you don't want to come in, we would follow those regular rules, but you are no longer, required to stay in your home. You can go to the grocery store, you can go to the gym, and you can come to work. You're allowed to come to work, right? So as I noted, those exposure rules do seem to have been eliminated. However, it is confusing that that employee affirmation form still exists on the state website for the exposures, even though it's been removed from the actual criteria. Remember as well that employees are eligible for pay if they have a minor child or dependent who needs to quarantine or isolate as well. So if you have an employee who has a child or another dependent who, again, under the same rules, so test positive or has COVID symptoms, and your employee needs to care for that person, that employee of yours is eligible for this pay as well, but the same timeframes apply. So the child or dependent would only quarantine for 5 days, assuming symptoms were improving and they were fever-free. And there, the documentation would be a little different. You would be requesting that your employee provide documentation that their child or dependent needed to quarantine or isolate, and there is an attestation form. The attestation form allows it to be filled out for the employee themselves or their child or dependent. What we have found to be most effective, and this assumes that you have an HR team of some sort, what we have found is that trying to explain all of the rules to employees in anticipation that they might get COVID or they might have to quarantine or isolate is far too confusing and sort of potentially lends itself to abuse in some situations. So what we have found most effective with the employers we work with and our clients is to say, if you cannot come to work due to COVID, a positive test or COVID symptoms or a requirement to quarantine or isolate from the government, call your HR representative right away, within several hours before the end of that day, and just follow the instructions that you are given, because it is complicated for employees to try to figure out, well, when does my quarantine start? And can I come into work? And what do I do if I can? And do I get pay and do I not? I haven't found many people understanding of these processes that well. So what we really like is just give us a call. We will let you know if we need a positive test or the affirmation or some other documentation or proof. We will ask, when did your symptoms start? When did your positive test take place? If you had a positive test, we are seeing, because the 5 days starts from either the symptom onset or the positive test, whichever is first, we're seeing quite a few situations where an employee doesn't feel well. They don't feel well for a couple days. They go to their doctor. By the time they go to their doctor and test positive, they're already past their quarantine or isolation and they can go back to work that day. Sounds weird, sounds really crazy the day you test positive, but that's what we're actually seeing from some of these medical providers, because if you have symptoms for 5 days, technically you are out of quarantine after that, regardless of when you test positive. So that's confusing. So we want to really ask those questions. What happened? Did you test positive? Are you sick? Oh, okay. And then, when did you have symptom onset and when did you test? And then tell them, you can come back next Wednesday or whatever it might be, that sixth day after the positive test or the symptoms, and to let them know, check in on day 5 if you're still not feeling well, if your symptoms are getting worse, or if you still have a fever, do not come back on day 6. But just kind of walking them through their individual scenario is what we have found most effective. Talking about these things in abstract, I think, can be very confusing and does, in my experience, lend itself to a little bit more potential for employee abuse. And then just to note that the documentation around COVID tests and symptoms, those are medical information for the employees. So we do have to follow those documentation requirements. So do not put your COVID tests into your employee personnel file. That is prohibited. And do not walk around the office and tell all of your friends that so-and-so has COVID. I think we learned this early on. You can certainly ask employees whether they have COVID and whether they have COVID symptoms, and you can require that they provide you test information and all of that, but it's still constitutes medical information and may not be kept in the personnel file. It must be in the confidential medical file, and you should maintain the confidentiality because it's the right thing to do and because that's the law. All right, that was a lot. I'm going to shift to something a little simpler. So there are some updates to the lactation break rules. So again, it's been several years since this law originally came out, and now it has been amended. So the lactation break rules apply to public and private employers with at least one employee within the state. So basically everyone. And really, these rules talk about new requirements for break time and the space that's available for these mothers. And we do have a little window for implementation. This one takes effect June 7th, 2023. The stated purpose of this amendment was to ensure that nursing mothers have safe, hygienic, and convenient places to pump at work. And also, and you'll see this from what the changes are, to help employees feel more comfortable and respected when breastfeeding. So making sure that there is a space that is private, a space that is not a bathroom, a space that is not 4 buildings over and you have to walk really far to get there. So those are some of the reasons that were stated for these changes. All right, so what do we have here? So the break time, the amount of time that employees may take for these breaks. Previously, it was allowed 20 minutes every 3 hours. Now the breaks may be taken, and this is what the law says, each time such employee has reasonable need to express breast milk. So that could be more often than that based on their own specific circumstances. The location requirements have been enhanced pretty significantly as well. Employers must provide a location for employees that meets these 4 requirements. So close proximity to the work area, well lit, shielded from view, and free from intrusion by other persons. The designated location, if possible, and not an undue burden, and we'll talk about that a little bit, but it should include a chair, a working surface, nearby access to clean running water, and if the workplace has electricity, and electrical outlet. Additionally, the new amendment provides that if the employer has access to a refrigerator, employees must be allowed access to the refrigerator to store pumped breast milk. All right, so a couple of additional clarifications. There is a question as to whether there could be an undue hardship for providing these locations to employees. And the law defines an undue hardship as significant difficulty or expense when considered in relation to the size, financial resources, nature, and structure of the employer's business. So if any of these requirements poses an undue hardship, the employer just has to make a reasonable effort to provide the room or location other than a restroom or bathroom, and that is in close proximity to the work area and of course is private. So there appears to be the ability to state that this poses an undue burden, but again, based on the size of the company and the financials, if it is just a cost burden, that is difficult to prove in most cases. Employers also must adopt and distribute a lactation policy. This is a new requirement, a modified requirement. Previously, employees were to be provided with a notice of these rights upon returning from maternity leave. Now there must be a policy that has to be distributed to each employee upon hire annually and to be the employees returning following a maternity leave or a childbirth. It has to inform the employees of their rights, the procedures to request the room or location to pump breast milk, and to respond within 5 days to employees' request for that room or location. The state has stated that it will provide a model policy for this. I have not seen that come out yet. We do still have several months before this law takes effect, so we will look to that model policy from New York State. We recommend, that you incorporate policies like this into your employee handbooks or whatever policy distribution you have so that you're not literally distributing this annually specifically for this, but incorporating it into your regular standing policies and procedures. All right, we're getting along here. I think we're getting close to the end. So new rules regarding protected absences. This again was part of a host of changes passed by Governor Hochul in late 2022. So this does apply to all New York State employers with at least 1 employee. The law prohibits employers from penalizing workers for taking legally protected leave. And this takes effect next month, February 19th, 2023. The stated purpose for this new rule was concerns that existing protections are not sufficient to curb employers' use of no-fault attendance policies in a manner that penalizes employees for taking protected leave. We'll talk a little bit more about what that means. All right, so The key points are that this law prohibits employers from assessing demerits or occurrences or other points or deductions from a bank of time, which subjects or could subject an employee to disciplinary action for use of any legally protected absence under federal, local, or state law. So we'll talk more about what laws that refers to. Employers cannot threaten or penalize or discipline, fire, otherwise discriminate against or retaliate against employees for their use of lawful absences. Employers cannot have a no-fault attendance policy. This part's really important. Cannot have a no-fault attendance policy and absence control procedures which penalize workers for their use of legally protected absences. And so a list of some of the absences that will likely be covered are those under New York paid family leave that we just talked about, New York State paid sick leave, New York vaccine leave, COVID-19 leave that we spoke about, the federal FMLA, the ADA, workers' comp, and various other state leave laws. So New York State has a whole bunch of leave laws you're probably aware of, things like voting leave, domestic violence leave, military leave. There's voluntary firefighter leave, there's bone marrow donation leave, right? There's a lot of different protected leave types in New York State. And if you penalize employees at all for taking those protected absences, this law prohibits that. All right, so I spent a lot of time thinking about this rule and why this even was issued over the last month or so, because, you know, again, we certainly understand that frontline supervisors or folks who are not in HR might not always understand all of the different types of protected absences. But for any seasoned HR professional, you know, this is 101, right? We know that if we're writing somebody up, we're issuing an attendance violation, we're terminating someone, that none of the reasons in any way can relate to protected absences. And so I really tried to process, you know, why was this passed? What was it intended to address? And there was some language regarding attendance policies that have omissions or vague or unclear statements about whether protected absences will result in attendance violations. Someone from my office and I ran into a situation, you know, just this week where we were going through a handbook and we were reading an attendance policy, and there was exactly that. There was this statement that said something about, you know, if you have a New York State sick leave absence, you know, it may or may not count, you know, but your manager has to approve it or something like that. And it was completely vague, completely confusing, likely an omission of a statement of their real rights under New York State paid sick leave. And we kind of said, aha, this is it, right? Make it confusing. Don't mention what they're specifically entitled to take. Maybe they'll be confused and afraid enough that they won't take these protected absences, or they won't seek them in the right way. They won't say, I'm taking sick leave, I'm taking voting leave, I'm taking jury duty leave, and then they're in a situation down the road where they have attendance points for that occurrence. So I think it's really intended to address those vague policies, omissions of statements of protected leave types, and of course, maybe managers or HR folks who don't fully understand all of these protections and might be applying a no-fault attendance policy in a way that penalizes employees for the protected absences. So what we recommend is that if you have an attendance policy, that it clearly states that it does not apply to protected absences. We recommend that you have leave policies. So New York State says, you know, they have a list of required policies that you have to have in standalone policies or you have to have in your employee handbook. And that there's a catch-all that says your leave and paid time off policies have to be in writing. So even if it's not a specific statement in that law, because some of those that I mentioned, some of the voting, blood donation, voting is required, but some of those other ones where you can take time away, it doesn't require right in that law that you have a written policy on it, but New York State has said leave policies need to be in writing. And I think that's one of the other things is some handbooks or policies don't really tell employees all of the different things that they might be entitled to, because the law didn't say that we had to do that. And I can see an employer's perspective of saying, why would I issue a policy on something that is going to be difficult for me to manage at my business and I don't have to have a policy? It's the employee's obligation to know what things they can take time off for. And if the state wanted me to have a policy on this, they would have mandated it. So this law, I want to be clear, doesn't mandate that you have all of your leave policies in writing, but New York State has issued that broad statement that employee leave policies should be in writing and should be in your handbook. And then This last bullet, I really want to reinforce because if your employee is confused about the process to request protected time, it's not going to help you as the employer. If you are clear about the requirements, and it's kind of similar to the COVID time off, if you walk them through their specific requirements, it will be clear to them what they need to do, what they need to provide to you. And then if the employee doesn't follow the process, then it's not a protected absence. And so for this, it is important to say, what does an employee have to do to use that protected time? How do they get intermittent FMLA? How do they get sick leave? How do we know that it's sick leave and not that your car won't start? And so if we make the rules clear, it is easier to say that's not a protected absence because you didn't follow the process. We had quite a few situations over the last couple of years where employees didn't understand the COVID rules. And once they tested positive for COVID, they just stopped coming into work. They didn't tell anybody, they didn't give anybody a test result. And we realized a few days later they weren't coming to work. And then they're not answering the phone calls when we try to reach out. And then they say they don't have the test result anymore because it was a take-home test and they threw it in the garbage. And at the end of the day, if we weren't clear up front, what do you need to do and when? That's probably a protected absence because we didn't clarify how much time do you get for COVID? What do we need to prove that you qualified for this protected absence? So ensuring that your policies and procedures clarify the requirements on that employee for the absence to be protected. Just penalties here are listed for this one, for the protected absences. So these are quite steep. There is a private cause of action for employees who might be dismissed or damaged because the employer violated their rights to not be disciplined, let go for these protected absences. So the employee could have to be reinstated with front pay, back pay, liquidated damages, and those types of things. So there is that private right of action. And the Department of Labor can also issue civil penalties, 10,000 for the first violation and 20,000 for subsequent. So those are quite steep. All right. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I expect for this activity to increase under Governor Hochul. She has a stated agenda to improve workplaces for employees and families in New York State. And earlier this month, in her State of the State address, she spoke about several new workplace rules that she is pursuing. So just a couple quick notes on here. I mentioned the minimum wage, that her intention is to have those set increases, increasing the minimum wage by the consumer price index after the $15 per hour is achieved, which should happen later this year. She also spoke about reforming the traveling nurse agency staffing practices to increase transparency. So this rule would require nurse staffing agencies to file reports regarding wage payments and operational practices regarding agency nurses. The goal there is to provide information that might help healthcare organizations and unions, make different decisions regarding their staffing. She has stated that she wants to modernize and streamline the state's training and employment infrastructure to provide more workplace training for displaced employees. And then the last one that she spoke about was there was previously a position created, the Chief Disability Officer. This role has been modified a bit now, and the goal here now is to connect employees or individuals rather with disabilities to inclusive internships with state agencies with the hope of long-term stable employment. The stated goal of these changes are to increase employment and decrease poverty for individuals with disabilities across New York State. So definitely some more to come with workforce laws changing. That was a lot of information. I'm going to go to the Q&A and see what questions we have. So great question regarding the lactation breaks. The question is, does it only apply if an employee has to report to a public office or building? If an employee is fully remote, does an employer have to provide accommodations to the employee's home since that is their work area? So definitely the requirement to provide the location and the breaks applies to all private employer offices, it would not apply to the employee's own home if that employee was working remotely. Except for the break time. I mean, you do have to provide the breaks, but you would not need to provide a location within the employee's home. A question confirming that COVID pay is not connected to New York sick pay. Again, significantly confusing area that we encounter over and over again. And I believe that some of the language that is used on the state website increases this confusion. So when I talk about the COVID pay, I like to call it quarantine or isolation pay. And even when we build out pay codes in our payroll systems, I like to call it that, quarantine or isolation pay, not COVID sick pay, because it gets very confusing with New York State sick pay. So the requirement to pay your employee in full, assuming you have more than 10 employees. So again, under 10 employees, unpaid time for quarantine or isolation, and they may file for disability, or if they're caring for someone with COVID, paid family leave. So that would be through that insurance carrier, and you would pay them for that. The larger employers have to pay either up to 5 days or up to 14 days if the employee is under quarantine or isolation order and cannot work. It specifically states right in that law that you cannot deduct that time from any accrued time. You cannot take it from PTO. You cannot take it from the New York State sick pay bank. It is what one of my clients the other day referred to as an unfunded mandate, and it must be paid for by the employer, and it doesn't come from anywhere other than the employer. There's a question about 5 days versus 14 days for a large employer. So for employers over 100 employees for the COVID quarantine or isolation pay, the law permits the employee to be paid for up to 14 days. However, they have to be on a quarantine or isolation order for them to be eligible for pay. And so it's confusing because they didn't, when New York State first passed this law, the maximum quarantine time was 14 days. And then if you remember, pretty quickly, it was reduced to 10. And then more recently, it was reduced to 5. And so New York State didn't reduce it at that point. And also, you could go past the 5 days if you're not symptom-free or fever-free and symptoms improving. We have seen employees occasionally, not that often, go past the 5 days. So the pay requirement for large employers is up to 14 days. However, you only pay them for days that they're under quarantine or isolation, which is 5 days, as long as they are fever-free and symptoms improving by day 6. Extremely confusing, of course. Question about testing requirements. Can we require a PCR, or do we have to require an accept an at-home test as proof? It is my understanding that you can require a COVID test. You can require testing for different situations. There have been employers that required scheduled testing for employees in certain organizations. The only thing to keep in mind with that is that if you require testing, you have to pay for the testing if the employee has out-of-pocket costs, and you have to pay for the time to go get the testing. It might be inconvenient to your employees, whatever it may be. So we are often seeing small employers accept an at-home test and not make them go get an official test. But you are legally allowed to do that, but you might have to pay for it. Another question about confirming that COVID pay is not New York sick pay. 14-day requirement, is that per year? Excellent question. So in the state law, it says that employees may have up to 3 quarantine or isolations. That is total per employee. That is not per year. So there may be 3 different scenarios where they could take up to 14 days. Again, you still have to be under a required quarantine or isolation, but that could occur 3 times, and then you are out of time. We do have some clients that specifically load like that amount of time into a time off bank for quarantine or isolation in their payroll system. And so they know when the employee is out of the time. But again, if you're loading 14 days, they're not always going to use 14 days because it might just be the minimum of the 5. All right, we have a question about a salary plus bonus or commissions, and the salary is lower than the 55,000, but they make more than that because of the total compensation, do they have to be changed to hourly? So I believe that the answer to that is yes, because the salaried basis is a weekly salary amount and it has to be guaranteed. They have to make exactly that amount on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, the $1,064.25. So if the rest of the funds are coming from some other source and are not paid exactly that amount weekly, I think that you could have a draw on a commission over that amount, but you wouldn't be able to recoup it. I think that's the only way you could get a employee to be salaried and over the 55K, but have a commission structure would be a guaranteed draw that they don't have to pay back. That puts them over that amount and is paid weekly at, it's a weekly requirement. When we say the annual salary, that's just 52 times the weekly, but the requirement is that every single week that you work there, you make the exact same amount of money. That's what qualifies someone to be salaried. Yes, we can distribute the slides after the webinar, and we also have a recording that will be distributed to the participants. Another similar question regarding salaried exempt, where there is a salary component plus some other variable pay. So the question is for salaried exempt, does the employee's base salary have to be 55,341, or can you include bonuses and incentives? You cannot include bonuses and incentives unless that's paid weekly over that weekly amount, at or over the weekly amount. So there is a question about if the salaried exempt threshold is for all salaried employees. It notes that executive and administrative exempt have salaries, but the professional, sales, and computer may not. So I know for sure that the professional exemption does not have a minimum salary. I'm not 100% sure about. So to be exempt, you have to have the salary and you have to have certain duties, at least for most of the exemption criteria. So that for the executive and administrative, you definitely do. You can also be exempt if you're in a professional category or outside sales, not inside sales. And then there's a computer exemption. I do know for sure the professional does not have a minimum. Like lawyers and teachers and some of them, they don't have to have a salaried minimum tied to it, as well as the duties. I don't know off the top of my head on the sales and computer salaried. We can pull the, so New York State follows the federal FLSA in terms of the description of these salary exempt duties, the executive, administrative, professional, sales, and computer. But they have a higher salary threshold than the federal law, which I think is around $600 per week. So we can distribute with the materials, the opinion letters from the FLSA that describe the exemptions for the professional, sales, and computer. It includes right within those fact sheets whether the salary requirement is tied to that as well. Because I just looked at the professional one this week, and that one definitely does not. It specifically states that the salary requirement does not exist. All right, so there's a question about pay transparency and record keeping. It asks, should we track postings in a spreadsheet, the version of the job description used, and what the pay range was, etc. So I would hope that the regulations will clarify that. I have read the actual Senate bill many, many times, and all it says in there is that you must maintain records of pay ranges, including promotions and transfers, as well as the records of your job descriptions. So it is not clear whether you would track it on a spreadsheet or whether you keep copies of documents. I believe that you would probably need the actual job description versus listing out on a spreadsheet. I mean, I assume if you identified everything that you changed in the job description, detailed it all out, that might be sufficient, but it is not clear at all exactly what record requirements there are because the Senate bill is very, very short. But like I said, there will be regulations on that one. They will hopefully come out over the next few months and well before that September date. And hopefully that will be something answered in there. I do not have an answer to that. Does New York State have posters as a link that we can embed in our website? So all of the New York State required postings are on the New York State website under a section called required workplace postings. You can pull them down individually. I think it is questionable whether every single one on there is actually a required posting. For example, it talks about the notice of pay rate. I'm not aware that you need to post a posting that you have to give employees a notice of pay rate. You just need to give them the notice of pay rate when they're hired. So I would caution you that I'm not entirely sure that legally all of those actually are required workplace postings, but New York State does have a page that has PDF and Word document versions that you can pull down and upload. I don't believe there's a state. I suppose you could take the state required postings link and just embed that in your website. Again, personally, I like to make sure myself that each of the documents is what's actually required and post those documents. I don't like to refer my employees to the state for their answers, but certainly you could use that New York State required postings link if you wanted to. And then just remember that on top of that, it does require the federal ones as well. The federal Department of Labor does have a full list of required federal postings as well. And remember your industry specific ones. So there are industry specific, construction postings and things like that to make sure that those are up. So a really good question. I don't know if I have the answer to it. Whether you can, in your salary range, say up to a certain amount for your range, or do you have to have the bottom and the top? So again, hopefully this will be addressed in the regulations. The regulations have, I'm just going to pop back to that definition that we saw earlier of the pay rate. I believe it said a minimum or maximum, or what the actual rate is that you believe to be accurate. Just take a peek here. Yeah, so in the current bill, it says the minimum and maximum annual salary or hourly range of compensation for the opportunity that the employer in good faith believes to be the accurate at the time of the posting. So it does say minimum and maximum and the range. I see jobs all the time that have one rate posted and literally a range doesn't exist. Many jobs, there's just a starting rate and that's what everybody's hired at. I believe in that situation, you wouldn't have to come up with a range because it literally does not exist. But again, with the regulations that are coming out, hopefully we'll get more clarity around what those ranges look like. I don't know if anybody followed what happened in New York City when they passed this law, which again has a few differences from the statewide law, but in New York City, a lot of the employers posted really, really large ranges and got in some trouble for that. I think it was Citigroup or something posted a position and the range was like 50,000 to 2 million, and then of course they had to say it was a typo because the Department of Labor easily could say that is not what you in good faith really feel is the accurate range for this posting. Yeah, we will provide the slides. Yeah, lots of really good questions around state transparency of pay that, again, we have very little information. This is not something we could implement as is. So we do hope those regulations come out ahead of the September date so we have time to read them and understand them and follow them. So there's a question about what if during the hiring process, the salary range changes? Do we have to regularly update the pay range on the posting? I believe the answer would be yes, but that is not clear from the very short law that we have to read. The fact that you have to maintain records of the changes in the range tells me that you would need to, repost that. I think that just knowing New York State, I would be shocked if you could post a range, change it the next day, hire somebody in the range that you didn't post, and that wouldn't be illegal. That feels like that would be illegal from New York State's perspective. And then another really excellent question, what if in the end a company goes outside of the posted range because of negotiation or whatever other reason? And so, we certainly know that does happen. I think, in large organizations, there are sometimes rules that you cannot go over the maximum of the range. So I don't know, I don't have an answer to that, and hopefully the regulations would speak to that. But the one thing that I will say is it says that the employer in good faith believes to be accurate at the time of the posting. So I certainly think that if you post a range in good faith and then later realize you're significantly under market or can't find a single person with that range, that you could make a offer outside of that range. It is exactly 1:30, and that concludes our presentation as well as Q&A session. As mentioned, I will make sure that the recording and slides are distributed to the participants. And thank you so much again for attending today. Have a great rest of your week.